And why don't we start? I'll just say that you're Thorsten, you're a design principal at Studio Gang and have been there for almost 2 decades, 18 years and 5 months. It says. I don't know how they update that, on LinkedIn. It must be a great algorithm to keep the months changing. And you've worked on some of the most extraordinary and notable projects. And Gregg's joining us early. That's great. Projects for the office. I remember the transformation that Lakeshore Tower gave to Gregg. Thank you for joining us. I have a little bit of an echo. I'm not sure why. I won't mention all of the projects. I mean, that'll come out in the presentation. Your master's degree was conferred in Berlin in 2003, which makes you considerably younger than I am, but with much more of a portfolio. So I'm so glad that you're able to join us this morning. And I'll keep the bio, the intro short. If you want to get started, I'm sure we'll be joined at the regular time by many others, and that's part of the reason I wanted to do the recording.
Gotcha. All right. Yeah, fair enough. I don't want to linger too much on myself. Yes, I'm a design principal at Studio Gang, and I've been there for a long time. And it's definitely been interesting to see the firm grow. When I started, we were in the single digits. I think there were 9 people, and that includes Jeannie, Mark, and an intern. And at this point, we're 120 in 4 different offices. So clearly the scope of the work and the way we all work together has changed in a big way, but I feel like the quality and the energy and diligence and all those kind of things are all that the studio stands for, definitely have stayed the same. And I think that the project I'm talking about today, Vista Tower, is a good example of that. I just want to quickly mention that we're also joined by Gregg Garmisa, who's our general counsel, and I think has a speaking role later on. And then I think Meredith, our financial CEO, will join us later as well. And then also on the phone is Mauricio Sanchez, who's technical director at Studio Gang and who did a lot of the Q&A on this project, and there's some really technical questions he may have a better chance to answer those about this project. The reason we chose, or I chose Vista Tower to talk about today, is that it feels like a quintessential Chicago building to us. It's got 97 floors and at almost 1,200 feet tall, it's appropriately located in the birthplace of the high rise. And it's definitely inspired by the same spirit of invention from that time, as it employs similar ideals of efficiency and a similar desire to push materials to the next level, such as parts of the structure, as well as the facade. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. It's very much inspired by its location on the intersection of the lake and the river, which also happens to be a very historic site. And again, I've got some information about that. And then it also has made history itself already by being the highest building ever designed by a woman. And we're very excited about what that adds to its neighborhood, as well as our amazing skyline. I'm going to go through a little bit on the team, the site, some details on the building, and then I've got some highlights on a couple of structural conditions and some construction photos, which we may not get to all of that. So Studio Gang, as mentioned, was founded in '97 and by Jeannie Gang. Now we're about 120 people with offices in Chicago, New York City, San Francisco, and Paris. In terms of what we do, residential towers such as Vista are certainly part of the scope. Lakeshore Tower, pictured in the middle here, was one of was the first one of this scale, and certainly something that put us on the map. But we also put a lot of focus on institutional work, such as the American Museum of Natural History in your neck of the woods in New York. That's under construction. Jeannie's mantra is that architecture is for people, and public buildings give us the opportunity to reach the most people, and so that's why we're interested in that. And for residential towers, that means we're very interested in how they meet the ground and how they become a good neighbor, and that's one of the topics going on in the later slide as well. For similar reasons, we're also interested in civic work, like the Memphis riverfront concept. You can see on the upper left, that was a very expansive study of the entire riverfront of the river. I forget now exactly, it's tens of miles all the way up and down. And that actually has led to a couple of follow-up projects, such as the Tom Lee Park, which we're working on. And then there's a couple of other architectural projects that some other name firms are working on now that were spurred by those efforts. And then to round up our overall sort of breadth, we've done a couple of exhibits. Always interested in doing those on a totally different scale, including one about ourselves at the Art Institute here in Chicago. And we always like to look at, simple, regular materials in a new and interesting way. And you can see, you might recognize that image on the lower right there, Rick. That's the project that we worked on with you, and some interesting exploration of the terracotta there. Beyond us, we were design lead on the project, but as you can imagine, a project with, I think, 2 million square feet and the height and size that I mentioned before takes a village. There's a lot of people on the team, all of them certainly not even mentioned here, but you can see it's even 3 different architecture firms that were involved here. So lots of coordination, and also feels a little bit like a Chicago thing, is this collaborativeness. All right. Diving into the site, it's a very historic site. As you can see, this is about the first depiction of anything in the Chicago area in 1820. Jean-Baptiste du Sable was the first settler, and he didn't know, but our site was pretty close to where he started the entire city, which of course is based around location on the lake and on the river. And then within only, a few decades, the city really had come around and started growing extensively, and not just landward. And of course, you can see, the basis of the grid, but all the center of the city still grouped around the river, which was the main means of transportation. But you can also see there's a train line now coming in from the south on the left here. Can you see my cursor? That ended up being, of course, a big influence on Chicago as well. And again, our site right there in the center of everything. 1892, the city starts growing. You can see that train line is now completely on land, no longer a sea bridge. Everything very infrastructural. That's the nature of the city, and that continues to be the case. In 1929, the site is now no longer as surrounded by boats. Now trains have taken the reins, if you will. Everything here is infrastructure, and that was the case for a long time in Chicago on the lakefront. This is the arrival of Lakeshore Drive in 1949. It's a road that still exists, but not in this configuration. You can see that the site is now located this corner, which was deemed really dangerous. Lots of accidents happened there. And in 1993, that was rerouted, which when the excavations were happening on site, we were still finding some boulders from that street, and we had to even work around some of them. But what the rerouting also did is, along with a lot of that infrastructural land in the vicinity that's now turned into parks, as you can see on the left, our site was now united and ready for redevelopment. And so in 1996, this master plan came around, which I believe was spearheaded by SOM at the time. And you can see that our site really is a landmark location at the end of this axis, and I should have mentioned this on the image before. You can see that, that bit of Lakeshore Drive that's going along Grant Park and the harbor facing straight on our site. And you can, see on the images, the two images on the right from that master plan, that from the get-go was indicated as a landmark location. For a couple of short years before development really kicked in, this site turned into a golf course, and I'm told that that's for tax reasons. But then in 2003, construction really began. The first thing that was built on the site was the Central Park, but then so in a couple of short years, you can see how it's really started to fill in. There's a whole bunch of buildings, including Aqua that I mentioned before, and you can see the Central Park there. And the site, again, in line with that strong city access coming from the south. The development overall still has a lot of parts left. You can see towards the lake, there's still a lot of construction happening today, but it's a really nice community. So a couple of topics that I wanted to talk about: the design, quickly about the tower geometry, which is about how we develop the shape, and then talk a little bit about the urban component, city connectivity, which is about how the building becomes a good neighbor. And then a little bit about the facade materiality, which was the quest for the look and the materiality to get that right. Tower geometry, you can see this is how we start a project. Lots of iteration, but some themes that really stuck right from the beginning. There's this idea of splitting the tower into 3 pieces in order to make room, be able to lift the center part up and let the city flow through below. And also this idea of modularity, and I'll touch on that a little bit more as well. But I think, in terms of overall strategy, how we tackled a building of this magnitude to make sure that it doesn't overwhelm visually and the way it touches the ground, I think a big component of that was this modularity, and the way to get to the modularity. There's several ways of stepping the massing. 3 steps. The first one is a stepping per floor, and that has some interesting challenges both for the structure as well as for the facade. You can tell on the right image, we're told by the contractor that he got various calls from people telling them that something seemed to be going wrong with those columns because they weren't lining up. But this was on purpose. Something that we really like about this building is that while it has this really sinuous feel when you look at it from a distance, there's actually no curve in the massing, and only very few conditions where structure isn't completely vertical. And so, stepping these columns is one way of doing that. Stepping the facade by 5 inches in and out per floor for 12 floors, and then reverse was the way to make this dynamic happen from a facade point of view. The basic building module is a geometric shape called a frustum, which is essentially a cut-off pyramid. This module can be flipped and stacked, which creates what we call a stem. So there's 3 stems here. And those placed next to each other nest seamlessly, and that makes the overall volume feel assembled as opposed to monolithic. And that was important, is that it's not about designing or coming up with an iconic shape, but it was about almost like a brick wall, assembling this massing out of individual pieces. And then another advantage of this more dynamic overall massing is that the undulating edge limits wind forces that would otherwise occur. The second stepping move is a stepping over height. The stems are dropping off towards the lake, creating a really slender top. which gives the tower its unique identity in the skyline. This move also provides a minimal top-tier floor plate. So you can see that here in comparison to some of the other classic Chicago towers. And that and one effect of that is that it minimizes the shadow that it casts on the surrounding neighborhoods, which it's just the kind thing to do in an urban context. The stepping stems also provide terraces that are used as amenity spaces facing the lake, and which have interior amenity floors associated with them on the same level. The lowest one here is used by the hotel. I'll talk about the program in the building a little bit later. The middle terrace there is a condo amenity floor, and the top one is actually private. So somebody has the highest outdoor pool in Chicago on that level. The third stepping move is stepping in plan, which is done to further break down the volume by more clearly distinguishing three stems, and it also makes the building adjust to the site better. You can see there's that Lakeshore Drive north has the angle of the river there, and that move adheres to that geometry, but it also creates two plazas with the residential entry on the southwest side and the hotel entry drop-off on the northeast side. And that kind of stepping also creates more corners, which is obviously attractive. The more corners you can have, corner units you can have, the more high quality units you get. A couple words on the city connectivity. What we asked ourselves, and I've mentioned this before, is how can a tower like this, of this scale, be a good neighbor? And of course, the way it touches the ground is essential for that. In this case, if you know the area, you'll know this happens to be an area that has several levels along Lakeshore Drive. There's upper, lower, and sub Lakeshore Drive that historically had different roles. There was like a delivery level, a car drive level, and a pedestrian level. The lowest level, sub Lakeshore here, not very attractive, but it has a lot of potential because you can see that tiny little hole back there connects directly to the Riverwalk. So step one to make this tower, improve that part of town was to make that connection, really put some effort into it from a design point of view, which meant activating the sides of the walls, putting some generous lighting, and then also this generous inviting gesture at the top with a plaza on top where the views towards the building and views towards the park can be had. The second connectivity is on Upper Lakeshore, where the project provides basically the missing puzzle piece of the city fabric by completing that the neighborhood ring road. You can see the condition before was that it was literally just a missing piece of road with two dead ends or three dead ends. That's now been connected. And I actually drove that road a couple of days ago, and it's really kind of exciting to have that ring road completed, and it's an advantage for pretty much all of the residents, not just of our building. That's a view of the plaza with the residential entry in the background, and you can see the connection under the building, under the middle stem through to the other side. An initial thought was that none of the structure in that area would come down. It proved quite challenging, but we still managed to keep that area free from cores and consolidate the structure that's coming down here significantly. And so while there are some columns, it was quite a feat to limit it to the ones that we have here. On the other side, you can see the entry to the hotel on the lower right there, where that light is emanating from. And again, the significance of this site right at the mouth of the river with Navy Pier in the background. Moving on to facade materiality. an early idea here was to find a new and interesting way of using glass. And we were inspired by the beautiful and varied colors of Lake Michigan, but also wanted the color of the glass to increase the dynamic of the geometric shape. And you can see that a little bit here where the wider floors have a brighter glass and the deeper floors have this darker glass. So the challenge we set for ourselves was to find glass with this consistent change of color. And the result would be a perfect gradient matching the beautiful lake blue of Lake Michigan. That was, but it also, we wanted the glass to be readily available on the market to control cost. There's a lot of things you can do with coating glass, but that quickly gets challenging on the cost front end. While this is, you know, the projects of this size always have these kind of cost pressures. So unfortunately, we found out the hard way that glass was generally simply not made that way. If you've ever tried finding 3 or 4 colors that work together, you know, that's hard. But finding a smooth gradient of 6 colors, and especially in the changing light conditions and changing reflection conditions that happen on the project, for obvious reasons, it was essentially impossible. And so after collecting virtually every glass sample we could get a hold of for over a year, we were almost ready to call it and have the whole tower glazed in a single color. So you can see in the image here, were some of the sort of armatures, I should say, not amateurs, armatures that we built to test all the glass that we could find. And while some of those were promising when you put them on the white table on the right, you can see on the left, you're starting to get some blues and some whites, and it's just really difficult to control. And this is maybe just a point in terms of what it takes sometimes in design, which is being stubborn as an essential ingredient of pushing the envelope, literally in this case. Because days before the final decision, a new technology showed up on our doorstep. I don't even exactly remember how we found out about it. It may have been a rep reaching out because everybody knew we were looking. And this is a product called Coating on Demand, which promised that we could fine-tune glass colors and performance in near infinite increments at a competitive cost with samples available almost immediately. And so they shipped us out to their lab. You can see us here in a room with the color, color palette on the left, and doing some real-time digital adjustments. And then the next day they had samples of this scale ready for us to look at. And what you see here is essentially the colors that ended up on the project. So this was really a super exciting achievement. And you can imagine that we were really excited that we got that sort of, found this level of progress just on time. And again, here's just another image of what it looks like today. You can see what I've been talking about before, that view corridor along the southern axis of Lakeshore Drive. And we believe this really beautiful color of the facade. So that's about the design. A little bit more on, I think we've got plenty of time, a little bit more on the program and some other technical facts about the building. It's got about 400 residential units and 200 hotel rooms. The hotel is on the lower 12 floors. You can see that indicated in this blue color here. Below level 1, those are 5 parking levels, but they are above ground. And that's the reason that level 1 is up there is what I mentioned earlier. There's 3 levels of city surrounding us here. Going through the tiers, the condo tiers here, you can see on level 1346, we've got a total of 9 condos. That's the basic layout. You can see they vary from 1 to 3 bedrooms. Some of them are also designed so they can be combined, even though that's a little bit more of a thing that happens in the upper tiers. The higher you go, of course, the more the cost increases. You can see here one of the other interesting challenges of the stepping building like this is that we have to step the egress stairs that were going from one stem to the next in order to make sure that we have our required 2 egress paths. One thing maybe to point out on this previous slide here again is that you can see this really significant wall that's connecting the 2 cores. That's a critical structural element. I'll get to that again in a minute. Just wanted to point that out here. And then the top floors, for those so inclined, are all penthouses, 12 of them. Those can also be combined, and I'm not 100% sure, but if anybody's interested, we can probably put you in touch with the sales crew on those. The amenity floor has, all kinds of really luxurious amenities, including various lounges, a theater, a gym, an outdoor deck, a kitchen or a demonstration kitchen, things like that. And then notably this, the deck with a pool. And from what I'm told, this is getting some pretty good use already. Couple of highlights on the structure, just a very, very diagrammatic image of how the stepping was done. You can see this is a section through a column. So the lower part here is, the column of the lower floor. Then we've got the slab stretching across and this 5-inch offset of the column above. And the way that is structurally done, probably not a surprise for y'all being in construction management, is that a significant part of the rebar is overlapping here, and that's how we get the structural efficiency. And this is also an efficiency just for the whole construction process, because dealing with any kind of angling part of structure is always an extra challenge and a premium. So this was almost cost neutral to a regular straight up structure. Again, here is that connection wall on the center tier of the column of the building that provides lateral stability between the cores and also allows us to not have to have a core in the center for that street coming through below. However, in the process, and this is also something that always happens in a design process, we had the building in the wind tunnel very early, and it was performing really well because, as I mentioned, the edges of the building are very animated, which avoids vortices. And I have a slide for that as well. But when we came back after some design progress and some of the building had to, the difference between the widest and the narrowest floor had to change a little bit for the reason of efficiencies and layout challenges. The dynamic of these edges was limited, and it turned out that the building, while still fully structurally stable, had too much sway. So in order to tackle that, one of the, here's my slide that's showing that winds coming from the side are a structural challenge, but what they do is create these vortices on the corners, and they create a cross sway, and that is what gets into the area where comfort levels for users are challenged. So that's something that was happening in the model. So what we have on top of the building then, in order to counteract that, are a couple of tuned mass dampers that are essentially just big volumes of water that move slower than the building and balances out the movement. And then we also introduced the first low-through floor in Chicago. I know there's a couple of buildings in New York that feature a similar technique. And what that does is, A, it interrupts the vortices coming down, and B, it provides an opportunity for some of the wind to go through right where the cantilever the force on the building would be the maximum. So this is a really interesting opportunity structurally to basically ease the pressure on the building significantly. Another sort of special moment in the building, I said there aren't any leaning columns, and that's not totally true. There's a couple of them, and that's for this volume at the bottom that we're calling the cube. It's consolidating. It's supporting this volume that's taken out on one side without adding in columns below. So you can see that the column reaching out all the way to the right here, that's actually supporting the slab of that volume, and then the slabs below that are actually hung from above. And then you can also tell that some of the tower columns here are being consolidated into just 3 columns coming through that street area, which is no simple feat for a building that's got 70 floors above. And then to wrap it up, a couple of construction images. So this is what the site looked like before. You can see that the connection flew to the river and navy pier in the background. This is right before we started. A lot of exploration happening in the below ground area here, because there are some historic tunnels, and the drilling machines can't get to some of the rails that are in those. So that's always an interesting part of putting the schedule together. Then the caissons are being poured. You can just see the scale of those. They go down 115 feet. I forget now exactly how many of those we have. And then they're bound together by an 8 to 10 foot thick mat slabs that took, I think, 24 hours to pour. There were hundreds of these trucks lined up all day to get that thing poured. Always a super exciting moment in the construction process. And you can see the scale of that by virtue of people literally walking around in those rebar cages. Then you can see, again, there's no basement in this building, so the columns are coming out of the ground here. And on the left, you can see the core. And then we've got the slabs coming in. This is the slightly more complicated pouring of those few angling columns that then support the slabs below and above. This is an image just showing every scrap of space that was available in this relatively tight urban environment was used for staging. I think this is actually the roof of that lower volume, but we were also making use of any bit of that cul-de-sac road below to stage all this stuff. This is the facade in the testing facility where we're throwing water at it to make sure that it's watertight. That was quite the process. And then step-by-step installing of the facade. You can see the slab edge covers went in first. And then it was a critical installation advantage to be able to install all of the glass from inside the building. They have this little special crane thing here that sits on the floor, and then you can just move the panel to the facade where it can then be installed essentially by 2 people. So that's a lot of construction efficiency. Also, these panels didn't have to be delivered by crane. They can come up through the hoist. So again, a lot of savings in scheduling time. And here we're at the part of the building that is just a single stem. So almost at the top. And then topping out. And that's it.
Great presentation, amazing building. I think one of the reviews of the design that I read from Michael Lewis, architecture critic, said it was easily the most important addition to the Chicago skyline in a generation. He added that it was no small feat to do that in America's most celebrated architectural city. I mean, just seeing this image, Thorsten, shows how transformational that is for for this skyline is seen not only from the lake, but really from all over Chicago, I'm sure. So thank you for great presentations, comprehensive. I'd also like to mention we've been joined by Taniaski Peñamora, who I work with at Columbia and used to work with at DDC, who's the director of the Center for Buildings, Infrastructure, and Public Space. But Taniaski, I don't think you have access to a camera on your device. But thank you for being here for the presentation. I don't know if you wanted to say anything.
Yeah, thank you, Rick. Again, thank you for such a Johann for such a wonderful presentation. Very thorough, interesting project. I know that the whole team that was involved in have been one of those jewels on the crown, and I'm glad that you are able to share that with the students. I really enjoy how thorough you were from the process, the construction, and the challenges, particularly due to wind and the solutions that came out. So I just want to thank you so much for taking time to share with us your work, and I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Our pleasure. And yeah, I know. I mean, it was definitely a lot of pressure, you know, because we knew that we're, you know, not just building anywhere. We're adding to a very storied, as I mentioned in the beginning, site and a very beloved skyline. And but glad, you know, always, of course, it's exhilarated to hear that people seem to be taking to it and giving us comments like the one you just quoted. So,
I have a few questions, and I'm sure the students do too. And I'll start, and please, anyone on from our program who wants to jump in, just raise your hand. Why don't we start with your question, Chijas, and I'll follow up. You have the floor. You want to turn your microphone on? There you go.
That was really very insightful presentation. So my question is, why such an unusual column design are used at the building's perimeter?
Okay, there's a couple of reasons for that. One is cost, and this went through several rounds with a number of both on the client side as well as the contractor, but the determination in the end was that doing a sloping columns was the alternative. I mean, first of all, of course, you know, I mean, I hope I've explained well the reason for the shape. So there were two alternatives to do this column. One was sloping and one was stepping. And the sloping one just ended up being more expensive, more complicated, adding more time to the schedule. And then it also turned out that from a point of view, actually, I should say there was a third option, which was to just have the columns go straight up and down. But that in some cases, with a total difference between the floors, between 5 to 8 feet, created a problem for the layout of the units that was just detrimental to the point where getting a little bit more creative with the columns was definitely worth it. So it's a mix between cost, schedule, and then efficiency of the floor plans, which led to this decision.
Okay, thank you.
You started the presentation by talking about the history of development in Chicago and the importance of this particular site. And in the presentation, Thorsten, you talked about city connectivity. And also, I think on the website, there's great description about the building serving as porous connection. I have a question about that connectivity because I may not have adequately understood the nature of the plaza. I see that you described that the residential entrance comes to it. And I'm sure there was a lot of discussion about how to keep that from becoming a private precinct of people who are in the residential tower. So I guess my two-part question on connectivity is, you know, the nature of semi-private, you know, privately owned public space. How does it become part of the city fabric and not simply in amenity and pertinence of both the hotel and the residential tower. And secondly, I didn't quite understand the connectivity to Riverwalk. We had an interesting presentation yesterday from Carol Ross-Barney and her office about Riverwalk, and you pointed out the possibility of a connection at the lowest level in what looked like a current parking garage. But I'm also intrigued by how one ramps down from the plaza. What are the points of connection, and does that foster a more public use of the plaza and the other public areas, you know, that pass through?
Yeah, it's a complex question. And so I'll say that, you know, some things I think are working well, and I can point those out. There's other things that were aspirations during the concept that we are still hoping to achieve at some point. But I think one thing that worked in our favor here is that this road that I'm pointing out here,
Yeah,
that was basically in the master plan, is that is going to be, I mean, it's privately owned, but this is a publicly accessible street that you can drive down. Thankfully, it's also a very slow speed kind of road. So there's a real emphasis on pedestrian traffic. A lot of the infrastructure and circulation around here is pedestrian only, like this connection here. And there is a significant amount of pedestrian traffic because, as you can tell, you know, all of these buildings around here, with the exception of the Swiss Hotel over here, are residential. So it's a really, really busy community, a really sort of like civic urban feeling area. And there's a lot of traffic. And so, you know, with this public road coming through here, that ensures that nobody's putting a fence around this area. And again, you know, it's not the only sort of part of, it's really continuing and completing a network of circulation. So that was working in our favor. And then on the hotel side, you know, this used to be sort of a I don't know, a dead end with like a construction trailer sitting on it for decades before this project came along, and it's still under construction at the moment because the hotel hasn't moved in yet and opened yet. But it will be a plaza from which, you know, it won't feel like a complete dead end anymore, because again, there's a pedestrian connection that's leading to another whole series of towers that are sitting a little bit further towards the lake. And, you know, this will be a main pedestrian connection as well. So I think it's just kind of fluing into the urban context as tightly as we've done here that really helped that. Some of the things that, one thing that I think worked out nicely is the little plaza moment overlooking the park below. I think that helps further activating and making it a moment to even stay for a moment up here, and creates a connection down to the park. In terms of physical connections down to the park, there is an elevator, a public elevator that's you know, accessible independent of the functioning of the building, that you can use to get from this upper level to the park and river level. But in two things that aspirationally still are a little bit lacking is there was an idea at some point to have an elevator on the river walk with the bridge across. That's something that hasn't shaken out for probably money reasons and maybe permit reasons. And then in terms of the connection to the river walk, you know, our design has done its part. As far as we can control that, we have. Unfortunately, the connection, and this isn't a parking garage, this is Lakeshore Drive.
Okay.
That's outside of our scope boundary. And while we had various designs that were reaching all the way, including, you know, adding a dog park and a playground and things of that nature, those are only things that we can sort of like pitch and propose, but that are unfortunately otherwise out of our jurisdiction. So I'm not totally aware what the latest thinking on that is, but I mean, you know, what we've done is lay the groundwork, and
And the proximity is there, the adjacency is there, so
Exactly.
it
So
should.
hopefully the pressures, I think there's some more development that's going to happen on that part of the Riverwalk as well. Even though if you ever actually make it to town, that is absolutely something you have to,
Yeah.
you have to go through. It's an amazing urban amenity.
I have two more questions, and one of them may be a segue to Meredith and Gregg's participation, because it is about money, and I'll do the technical question first, because it may be easier. The glass is phenomenal, and thank you for showing, walking us through the decision-making process about the glass and seeing the mock-ups and hearing, about how that came about was great. We've been hearing from others in Chicago and in just these last 2 days, and also been seeing in New York and elsewhere, major problems with supply chain. And that, could be for materials that were avoided in this building with the perspicacity of your office, and we could talk about those too. But glazing can sometimes be phenomenally difficult to assure. Feniowski and I were involved with a certain library in Long Island City where the glazing sort of got lost on a boat for a while. I won't record my thoughts about that here. But where did the glass come from, and how hard was it to assure that it would be there on time?
That's okay. So I can talk about the company that provided the cladding, but I honestly don't know exactly where the glass was made, because there's like several stages in the process of making the glass, but the significant process that really mattered to us, that happened in Germany.
Yeah.
And it is quite amazing that in a globalized world like this, you still have to go around the globe for these kind of things, and that makes financial sense. But yeah, I mean, the coating was applied at a company in Germany, but their research arm is sitting in Belgium. So it's I feel like technical advancement and process and progress like this still I don't know, takes a look around the world.
Yeah.
And I mean, thankfully this is all done before the supply chain issues really started happening. And project of the size, that was certainly also a certain I don't know, importance for the manufacturer, even though I mean they serve massive projects all the way around the world as well, of course.